In 1970s Britain, the high street was more than a place to shop. It was where neighbours recognised each other, where teenagers discovered who they were, and where ordinary routines quietly stitched communities together. The sound of market traders, the glow of shop windows on rainy evenings, the smell of fresh bread drifting onto the pavement, all of it created a rhythm of life that now feels strangely distant. But what exactly made those streets feel so alive? Here are 10 reasons Britain's high streets once meant so much more than shopping. Number 1. Shopping was a daily ritual. In 1970s, shopping was rarely rushed. People did not fill a trolley once a week beneath the fluorescent lights of a giant supermarket. Instead, daily life unfolded in smaller journeys, repeated so often they became part of the rhythm of the community itself. In the morning, someone might stop at the baker's for a fresh loaf still warm from the oven. Later in the afternoon, they would call by the greengrocer for potatoes or apples displayed in wooden crates out on the pavement. Then perhaps the butcher, where orders were wrapped carefully in paper while neighbours exchanged gossip beside the counter. The high street was not a destination. It was woven into ordinary existence. Children were sent to the newsagent with a few coins clutched tightly in their hands. Pensioners walked slowly from shop to shop, stopping every few yards for conversation. Mothers with prams chatted while queuing outside local stores. Even small errands carried a sense of familiarity and human contact. And because people visited so often, the street itself remained constantly alive. There was movement. Recognition. Routine. You saw the same faces almost every day. Today, convenience often means isolation. Groceries arrive silently at the front door. Self-checkouts replace conversation. But in the 1970s, even buying a loaf of bread could make you feel part of something larger than yourself. That was the quiet magic of the British high street. Number 2. Every shop had a human face. One of the most forgotten parts of the 1970s high street was how deeply personal it felt. Behind nearly every counter stood someone local. Someone who recognized your face before you even spoke. The butcher knew which family preferred sausages on Fridays. The baker remembered who liked their loaf sliced thick. At the corner newsagent, children were often greeted by name before they had even reached the counter with their comics and penny sweets. These shops were small enough for relationships to matter. And in many working-class communities, trust still carried real value. If money was tight that week, some customers quietly asked to pay next Friday. Often, the shopkeeper simply nodded. That kind of understanding could never be programmed into a self-checkout machine. There was warmth in these places. Not exaggerated friendliness. Not scripted customer service. Just ordinary human familiarity built slowly over years. The greengrocer might slip an extra apple into a child's bag with a wink. The fishmonger offered advice on how best to cook cod for supper. Even brief conversations carried a feeling of belonging. Today, many British high streets are dominated by chain stores where staff come and go so quickly that nobody learns your name. Transactions have become faster, but colder. Yet in the 1970s, people were not simply buying food or newspapers. They were maintaining relationships. And perhaps that is why those streets felt so alive. Because the shops themselves still felt human. Number 3. The high street was built around walking. In 1970s Britain, the high street was not hidden behind giant car parks or ring roads. It sat at the centre of everyday life. Rows of terraced houses often stretched only a few streets away. Children walked there after school with loose change in their pockets. Elderly residents caught the local bus into town carrying shopping trolleys behind them. And on Saturdays, families moved slowly along the pavement together, stopping to look into shop windows as traffic rolled gently past. The journey itself was part of the experience. People were not rushing from one isolated retail unit to another. They crossed paths naturally. Neighbours greeted each other outside the post office. Friends unexpectedly met near the market stalls. Even short walks created small moments of connection. Because the high street belonged to the neighbourhood, it felt familiar and lived in. You knew the shortcuts. You recognized the faces waiting at the bus stop. The street carried the feeling of somewhere shared. Today, many shopping areas are designed around cars, speed, and convenience. But the 1970s high street moved at a human pace. And perhaps that slower rhythm is part of why people still remember it with such affection. Number 4. Woolworths was the heart of the town. For much of 1970s Britain, Woolworths was more than a shop on the high street. It was part of growing up. The moment the doors opened, children rushed towards the pick-and-mix counter with paper bags in hand, carefully choosing cola bottles, pear drops, and chocolate raisins one by one. Teenagers drifted towards the record section, flicking through the latest singles while trying to look older than they were. Parents searched for school uniforms, birthday cards, kitchenware, and Christmas decorations, often all in the same visit. Almost everyone had a reason to be there. And because Woolworths welcomed every generation at once, it created something modern retail often struggles to recreate: shared public life. On rainy Saturday afternoons, families wandered slowly through the aisle simply to pass the time. At Christmas, the shop glowed with tinsel, colored lights, and stacks of toys that transformed ordinary town centers into something magical. There was excitement in the air. Not luxury. Not exclusivity. Just the comforting feeling that this place belonged to everybody. Today, many people remember the products. But what they truly miss is the atmosphere. Because for millions of Britons, Woolworths was not simply where you bought things. It was where everyday memories quietly happened. Number 5. Every street had its own character. One of the most striking things about 1970s Britain was how different each high street felt. You could arrive in a new town and immediately sense its personality. Not through branding or slogans, but through the shops themselves. Some streets glowed with flickering neon signs reflected on wet pavements after the rain. Others were lined with hand-painted storefronts faded gently by decades of weather. Greengrocers stacked fruit crates outside in uneven towers. Butchers hung painted price boards in their windows. Tiny independent boutiques filled their displays with strange mannequins, bold colors, and homemade decorations. Nothing felt perfectly polished. And that was precisely the point. Each shop carried traces of the people who owned it. Their humor. Their taste. Their habits. Even the imperfections gave the high street life. Today, many British town centres feel strangely interchangeable. The same chain cafes. The same grey signage. The same carefully controlled interiors repeated from city to city. But in the 1970s, high streets still reflected local identity. You remembered certain corners because they looked unique. You remembered certain shops because they could not exist anywhere else. And perhaps that individuality made people feel more connected to the places they lived. The street did not feel manufactured. It felt real. Number 6. Street markets brought noise and energy. In 1970s Britain, Market Day could transform an ordinary high street into something almost theatrical. Before you even reached the town centre, you could usually hear it. Traders shouting prices across the pavement. Lorries unloading crates at dawn. The distant hum of chatter drifting through narrow streets already crowded with people. Fruit and vegetables spilled from wooden stalls onto the roadside. Clothing rails swayed in the wind beneath striped canvas covers. Some traders joked loudly with customers. Others barked bargains with astonishing speed, their voices becoming part of the soundtrack of the town itself. Nothing about it felt quiet or controlled. There was movement everywhere. People squeezing past each other with carrier bags. Children weaving through crowds. Music escaping from nearby record shops while the smell of fried onions and fresh produce hung in the cold air. The markets brought unpredictability. A sense that something was always happening. Modern shopping centers may be cleaner and more efficient, but they often feel strangely silent by comparison. Every surface polished. Every sound carefully managed. But the old British street market felt gloriously human. Messy. Loud. Full of personality. And for many people, that noise was not an inconvenience. It was proof that the high street was alive. Number 7. Teenagers actually hung around the high street. In the 1970s, the British high street was not just for shopping. For teenagers, it was a stage. Long before smartphones and social media, young people went into town simply to be seen. To meet friends. To discover music. To experiment with identity. Outside record shops, clusters of teenagers leaned against windows covered in posters for the latest singles and concerts. Some wore leather jackets covered in safety pins. Others walked proudly in sharp mod suits or towering glam rock boots. Punks with brightly dyed hair passed skinheads in braces and Dr. Martens, while transistor radios played somewhere in the background. The high street carried the restless energy of youth culture. And because these groups occupied the same public spaces, town centers felt alive with personality and unpredictability. Every Saturday afternoon brought movement, noise, and fashion that older generations often struggled to understand. Teenagers lingered for hours around cafes, bus stops, arcades, and music shops because there were few other places to go. The high street became their social network before the internet existed. It was where friendships formed. Where first romances quietly began. Where people discovered who they wanted to become. Today, much of that culture has disappeared indoors or online. But in the 1970s, British town centres still belonged partly to the young. And their presence gave the streets a pulse that could not be manufactured. Number 8. Cafes, wimpy bars, and pubs kept people together. One reason the 1970s high street stayed busy for so many hours was because people did not leave immediately after shopping. Places like Wimpy offered something modern retail spaces often forget: somewhere to remain. Older residents sat for long conversations over tea in steamy cafes with fogged-up windows. Teenagers shared chips after school while music played softly from nearby jukeboxes. Workers stopped at pubs on the way home, loosening ties and exchanging stories from the day before walking back through the evening streets. The high street changed character as the hours passed. In the mornings, it belonged to shoppers and pensioners. By afternoon, teenagers and young families filled the pavements. And by evening, warm pub lights spilled onto wet roads as laughter drifted through the town centre air. There was continuity to it all. The street remained social from morning until night. Today, many town centres empty the moment the shops close. Metal shutters come down. Lights disappear. The streets fall strangely silent. But in 1970s Britain, the high street still functioned as a public living room. A shared place where different generations occupied the same spaces together. And perhaps that constant human presence is what people truly miss when they remember those old streets. Number 9. Even window shopping felt magical. In 1970s Britain, people did not always visit the high street to buy something. Sometimes, they simply went to look. On cold Saturday afternoons, families wandered slowly beneath glowing shop signs, pausing outside department stores and small independent displays alike. Children pressed their hands against the glass of toy shops, staring at model trains, dolls, Scalextric sets, and bicycles arranged almost like miniature worlds behind the windows. At Christmas, the atmosphere became even more magical. Strings of colored lights stretched across town centers. Artificial snow clung to window corners. Mechanical decorations moved slowly behind the glass while shoppers gathered outside just to admire them. For many children, these displays became part of the memory of Christmas itself. And because entertainment inside the home was still limited, people experienced these moments together in public spaces. There was no endless scrolling. No personalized algorithm deciding what you should see next. Curiosity guided people instead. You wandered slowly. You noticed things unexpectedly. You stopped to admire displays even when you had no intention of buying anything at all. The high street rewarded observation rather than efficiency. Today, modern shopping often feels rushed and functional. But the old British high street understood something important. Sometimes people simply wanted to experience the atmosphere of being around other people. And perhaps that is why those evenings remained so vivid in memory. Because ordinary streets briefly felt magical. Number 10. People needed each other more. Perhaps the biggest reason 1970s British high streets felt alive was because people still depended on one another in ways that are now slowly disappearing. There was no online shopping waiting at the front door the next morning. No social media replacing face-to-face conversation. No smartphones filling every quiet moment of the day. If you wanted news, you walked to the newsagent. If you wanted company, you went into town. If you needed advice about fashion, music, cooking, or local gossip, you spoke to actual people. Daily life required physical presence. And because of that, the high street became something far more important than a retail space. It became the center of community life itself. People met neighbors by accident. Teenagers discovered friendships while lingering outside record shops. Elderly residents escaped loneliness simply by walking familiar streets where somebody still recognized them. Even small conversations mattered. Today, many conveniences have made life faster and easier. But they have also made much of life quieter and more isolated. The need to leave the house has slowly faded. And when the crowds disappeared from Britain's high streets, something else disappeared too. Not just independent shops. Not just old cafes or market stalls. But a certain kind of everyday togetherness that once held communities together almost without people noticing. The 1970s British high street was never perfect. The pavements were crowded. The weather was often miserable. And many towns looked rough around the edges. But those streets were alive in a way that many modern town centers struggle to replicate. Because they were built around people first. Not algorithms. Not delivery schedules. Not convenience alone. They gave communities somewhere shared to exist together. And perhaps that is why so many Britons still remember them with such affection decades later. Not simply because of the shops themselves, but because of how those places made everyday life feel.